It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. US Secretary of Defense is in South Korea to attend the annual defense ministerial talks between the two countries, the Security Consultative Meeting. Now, ahead of the talks slated for Thursday, Lloyd Austin emphasised the importance of bilateral ties amid the growing intensity of the US-China rivalry here in the Indo-Pacific region. And while the North Korea Agenda too is, of course, expected to be high up on the list of discussion points between Seoul and Washington officials. And ahead of the talks, for more, we connect with Mark P. Barry, an American expert who has been following North Korea and Northeast Asia affairs for over 3 decades, and he is currently the associate editor of the International Journal on World Peace. It's lovely to see you again, Dr. Barry. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm fine, thank you.
Well, your Secretary of Defense is in Seoul right now, and later on Thursday he's going to be speaking with Seoul officials at their annual defense meeting. And well, amid this intensifying rivalry between the United States and China, what do you think America's primary concerns are? What do you think Washington will be bringing to the table at this annual defense talk?
Well, the SCMs, as you said, are annual. They alternate between Washington, D.C. and Seoul. To his credit, Secretary Austin is making his second trip in 8 months to Seoul. In fact, I believe his first trip was with Secretary Blinken. So the United States has certainly been sending the right message under the Biden administration that it has a ironclad alliance with the Republic of Korea. This time, we're getting into what I would call some new terrain, where a wider prospective role for South Korea is being discussed, as well as another important stage in the likely, or at least prospective handover of operational control, or OPCON, to South Korea, which is something that's been going on for a long, long time among successive American and South Korean administrations. So, but the real issue is, what is the larger role that the United States wants South Korea to play, and does South Korea feel it's in their interest to do so? So this is a big unknown, and I think that the reason it's so unknown is because the U.S. abrupt and clumsy pullout from Afghanistan sent a chill among many of our allies, and I think particularly in Asia. We could see a somewhat more hawkish defense policy being espoused by Prime Minister Kishida in Japan. So right now, overtly it may seem it's the U.S. trying to bring together a tighter alliance with its allies in East Asia vis-a-vis China. But the real issue going on is, what is the nature of the relationship between the United States and South Korea, and the United States and Japan? Because that's where the fissures may or may not be becoming apparent.
The great unknown indeed. That has been the biggest question really here in the Indo-Pacific region, as both Washington and Beijing attempt to really increase their spheres of influence among these countries. And well, in terms of South Korea, it did seem to inch a little closer to the US earlier this year, perhaps in hopes of pursuing this North Korea engagement policy. But well, how involved do you think Seoul is going to be in the US's regional initiatives, such as the quadrilateral initiative, the Quad, and other initiatives as well, like the Build Back Better World plan and so forth?
I think to maintain alliance solidarity, South Korea wants to push it as far as they reasonably can, but never to appear as a utterly junior partner. They want to be, as much as possible, an equal partner. To change the relationship that has existed since the Mutual Security Treaty in 1954. South Korea has come a long, long way. And of course, the reality is that South Korea and China have a tremendous economic relationship. China is South Korea's largest trading partner. and not an unimportant trading partner for the United States either. So I think both the United States and South Korea are trying to explore what are the boundaries of how far they could push it to satisfy each other. The United States cannot cast off South Korea in a dismissive and cavalier manner, as may have been exemplified in part under the previous American administration. But at the same time, this is a sensitive time. This is 100 days or less before the March 9th elections in South Korea. So I think it's kind of like everyone's just sort of feeling out how far they can go. And probably what will happen is nobody's going to fully get their way, but they'll find an accommodation. I think that's the best word. Maybe not a compromise, but just an accommodation where everyone is comfortable, at least for the foreseeable 6 months or so. And then we'll see what happens, after President Moon steps down.
And well, of course, very high up on the agenda is going to be the OPCON transfer, the transfer of operational control. What would be the US's position on this, and how do you think the talks might play out?
It was something, as I said earlier, that was going to happen years ago. It didn't happen. I have a feeling if a conservative government is elected in March, that can will be kicked very far down the road, and we may not see that matter come up for another 5 years. On the other hand, I find it, for understanding how American foreign policy and defense policy, the assumptions that undergird it, I find it very hard the United States wants to give up control of operational control in wartime. To expand the point, the United States, even with the notion of an end of war declaration, if that even comes about, I think is very uncomfortable with the idea of the disbanding of the UN command, which again is controlled by the United States as the leader of the contributing nations during the Korean War under the UN flag. So I think it's very difficult for the United States to actually give operational control, but it's taking these baby steps forward just to see, is there anything that the U.S. administration can agree to? But I think it really rubs them the wrong way. It's something that they can't say no to because it's a matter of ROK pride. But at the same time, the United States kind of wishes they could turn the clock back, but it also knows that that's not always possible when you have to deal with massive changes that are looming on the horizon.
And well, another idea that doesn't entirely sit comfortably with Washington is the idea of a peace declaration, an end of war declaration between the South and North Korea, of course. And well, from what we gather, it seems that the two sides, Seoul and Washington, they've been trying to talk about this idea, trying to see if it's possible over the last in recent months, and well, it seems that they can't seem to find a compromise on this. Where do you think they currently stand right now on that idea? Where do you think they stand in terms of North Korea engagement?
Well, Newsweek's Tom O'Connor, who I've been interviewed by in the past, reported yesterday, based on a conversation with a senior Unification Ministry official, that they're very close to language that they can agree on. I think Tom is trying to get a scoop, and he may be right. But if your sources are largely on one country's side but not on the other, if they're not coming out of the State Department and or the Pentagon, I have my serious doubts. And I think what the United States is trying to do is to show that it's in lockstep with South Korea, agreeing on those paragraphs that it has no problem with, and then find that they will come to a disagreement on the most critical matters dealing with nuclear weapons and so forth and so on, and find that they can't actually implement it. So I think the United States is trying to be a good senior partner, but at the same time, it really is not intending to concur with such a language of an end of war declaration. The way I see it is that how can an end of war declaration be that much different than the Singapore Declaration of June of 2018. What is absolutely necessary, however, is that, when the Korean War ended with the armistice on July 27th, 1953, the stipulation of the armistice agreement was that, I believe, in 6 months' time, a peace conference was to be held to create a final disposition of the consequences of the Korean War. And indeed, it was held, I believe, in May 1954 in Geneva. The United States was represented by Secretary of State John Dulles, and the meeting was stonewalled by Zhou Enlai of China, representing the other major signatory. So the problem is you've had a state of technical state of war in effect for over 70 years. You don't need an end of war declaration, but you do need a peace treaty. But that's a heavy duty thing. But you still, one way or the other, you're going to have to accomplish it. Whether the United Nations should be as deeply involved as it was 70 years ago is another matter. I think even Ban Ki-moon, when he was Secretary General, didn't want the UN to be quite as involved as it was then. And I'm sure Secretary Gutierrez is also of a similar mind. But, international law is international law. And peace treaties are peace treaties. And just because we have, wars that are different than World Wars I and World War II, doesn't mean that peace treaties are a thing of the past, or that the possession of nuclear weapons makes it a thing of the past. So I would say that an end of war declaration is a good start, but only if there is prior agreement to actually bring it to actual serious negotiations over the language of a peace treaty, which could take, till the end of the current Biden administration, even if they were to start tomorrow. But you're going to need that.
Well, whether we're going to start tomorrow, next year, in a decade or so, the first step needs to be taken to reopen dialogue and engagement with North Korea. And there seems to be different ideas and approaches to doing that. The US and South Korea, of course, they've offered dialogue, which seems to have been rebuffed by the North. And while China and Russia, they've been pushing for sanctions relief. What do you think is the next step? What do you think is the first step towards that, that revival of engagement?
From President Biden's point of view, he doesn't want to deal with the North Korean issue. I don't see any change in that. At the same time, we have a food crisis that's only going to get worse month by month in North Korea. We also have spent a lot of time on the Omicron variant and the fact that North Korea has even recognized that. That means they're going to bend over backward to be even more locked down, which is only going to cause tremendous suffering among the population. So it may be that President Biden will finally have to make the decision and tell Secretary Blinken, we've got to do something to help North Korea. We just can't let this go on, and maybe it will lead to something good. So it may be out of the depths of despair that the United States finally kicks in and provides a more vigorous support. I think in his first year as president, President Biden has bent over backward to dissociate himself from the Trump policy and from Trump's legacy. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There were some important accomplishments. And unfortunately, because the prior president did not graciously concede and apprise his successor of what he had accomplished, in his view, with Kim Jong-un, there was really no way for President Biden to build on that. But you can build on it because still agreements were made by the sitting president of the United States, and the United States should be good for its word. So there is a basis to do it, but it may have to be, as you hinted, on the basis of humanitarian aid, and then leading to other forms of cooperation. Unfortunately, North Korea doesn't seem to be very enthralled with the idea of an end of war declaration because sanctions, the removal of sanctions, or some of them are not on the table. So their view is what's in it for us. But the United States has to offer something more comprehensive, but it could begin with a more vigorous humanitarian assistance.
Right, so focusing on the current issues, hopefully we'll see some cooperation there. But well, this is where we'll leave the interview today. That was Mark P. Barry, Associate Editor of the International Journal on World Peace. Thank you again, Dr. Barry, so much for your wonderful and shrewd insights.
Thank you. Happy to be here.